The bedpan sailed through the air with impressive accuracy for a 50-year-old woman working her third double shift this week. It connected with Magnus Blackthorn's silver head with a satisfying clang just as he was leaning forward in his hospital bed. Nostrils flared like some demented bloodhound. "Did you just—" Magnus touched the spot where the metal had made contact, his dark eyes wide with what looked suspiciously like delight rather than outrage. "Did you just throw medical equipment at a dying man?" "I threw medical equipment at a perverted old goat," Elena Santos snapped, already reaching for another bedpan from her cart. "And if you ask me to let you taste me one more time, the next one's going to be full." 3 hours. She'd been dealing with this lunatic for 3 hours. Ever since she'd walked into room 237, expecting another routine check on the hospital's most infamous VIP patient. Magnus Blackthorn, 65-year-old CEO of Blackthorn Industries, billionaire extraordinaire, and apparently completely unhinged in his final days. The moment she'd stepped through the door, he'd taken one long, deep breath and declared, "You smell like home." Before she could even process that particular brand of crazy, he'd followed up with, "I'll give you $50,000 to let me taste you before I die." That's when the first bedpan had found its target. "Look, Mr. Blackthorn." "Magnus," he corrected, struggling to sit up straighter despite the oxygen tubes snaking around his face. The effort made the dancing puppies on his hospital gown ripple in the most undignified way possible. "And I wasn't being perverted." "Well, not entirely." Elena crossed her arms, her scrubs stretched tight across her generous curves. At 50, she'd seen enough dying rich men to know the type. Suddenly desperate to feel alive again, throwing money at nurses like it could buy them youth or absolution, or whatever it was their guilty consciences craved. Except Magnus Blackthorn didn't look guilty. He looked hungry. 100,000, he said suddenly, his voice rough from the medications. "Just let me." "Let you what, exactly?" Elena's voice could have frozen hellfire. "Because I'm thinking you've got about 30 seconds before I call security, and I don't care how many wings of this hospital have your name on them." Magnus tilted his head, studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "You really don't know, do you?" "Know what?" "What you are." Elena's blood pressure spiked. She'd dealt with racist patients before, though usually they were more direct about it. "I know exactly what I am. I'm a registered nurse with 25 years of experience, student loans that could finance a small country, and 0 patients for entitled billionaires having end-of-life crises." 200,000. The number hung in the air between them like a live wire. Elena's mouth went dry. $200,000 would wipe out her student loans, pay off her credit cards, and still leave enough for her daughter's college fund. It would change everything, which made it all the more insulting. "You think I'm some kind of prostitute?" she hissed, advancing on his bed with the righteous fury of an underpaid healthcare worker. "You think because I'm a woman working nights in a hospital, I'm desperate enough to—" "Not desperate," Magnus interrupted, his voice dropping to something almost like a growl. "Special." The word hit her like a physical blow. Special. When was the last time anyone had called her special? When was the last time anyone had seen her as anything other than tired, overworked Elena who picked up extra shifts to make ends meet? She shook her head, angry at herself for the moment of weakness. "I don't care if you're dying, Mr. Blackthorn. I don't care if you're worth more money than God. And I especially don't care if you think I'm special. What I care about is doing my job and getting home to my cat without having to explain to my supervisor why I assaulted a patient." Magnus studied her for a long moment, then smiled. It was a predator's smile, all sharp edges and dangerous promises. "Your cat. What's his name?" Elena blinked. "What? Your cat. Male or female? What do you call him?" Why do you care?" "Humor a dying man." Elena glanced at the monitors surrounding his bed. His heart rate was elevated but steady. His oxygen levels were low but stable. He looked like hell, all sharp cheekbones and gray pallor, but he didn't look like he was about to drop dead. "Unfortunately." "Whiskers," she said finally. "His name is Whiskers, and he's 12 years old, and he's probably wondering why I'm late with his dinner because I'm standing here listening to you make inappropriate propositions." "Whiskers." Magnus' smile widened. "A practical name for a practical woman. I like that. I don't care what you like." 300,000. Elena's knees nearly buckled. $300,000. The number seemed to echo in the sterile hospital room, bouncing off the machines and monitors until it filled every corner of her consciousness. "What?" she said very carefully. "Exactly what I have to do for $300,000. Magnus' eyes lit up like she'd just agreed to dance naked on his grave. Let me scent you. Let you what now? Scent you. Just let me smell you. Properly. Without all the hospital disinfectant and... He gestured weakly at the oxygen tubes. Without these things in the way. Elena stared at him. You want to pay me $300,000 to smell me? Yes. That's it? Just smell. Magnus hesitated, and something flickered across his face. Something that looked almost like pain. For now. For now. I'm dying, Elena Santos. Her name rolled off his tongue like he'd been saying it all his life. Heart failure, if you believe the doctors. And maybe they're right. But before I go, I need to know if you're what I think you are. Which is the answer to a prayer I stopped believing in 40 years ago. Elena felt something cold crawl up her spine. There was something in his voice, something that went beyond the ravings of a sick old man. Something that sounded almost like truth, which was ridiculous. She was a practical woman with practical problems, and practical women didn't believe in prayers or answers that came in the form of dying billionaires who smelled like danger and offered obscene amounts of money for the privilege of sniffing her neck. You're insane, she said finally. Probably. Magnus leaned back against his pillows, looking suddenly exhausted. But I'm also rich, dying, and desperate enough to offer you $500,000 if you'll just let me. $500,000? The words came out as a squeak. Magnus nodded, his dark eyes never leaving her face. $500,000, Elena Santos. Just to let me know if I'm right about what you are. Elena's hand moved unconsciously to her throat, where a small scar had been hidden beneath concealer for the past 15 years. A scar she'd never been able to explain, from a night she could barely remember. A night that had changed everything. What? She whispered. Do you think I am? Magnus' smile was slow, predatory, and absolutely terrifying. Mine. Chapter 2. Elena Santos had eaten chicken-flavored ramen noodles for dinner every night for the past 3 weeks, and she was starting to hate herself for it. Not because of the sodium content that could kill a horse, or the fact that it was barely classified as food, but because somehow that crazy billionaire in room 237 had known. You smell like sodium and sadness, he'd said during her last visit, those dark eyes studying her with an intensity that made her want to check if her scrubs were see-through. And artificial chicken flavor. Moroccan, I'm guessing. The cheap stuff. She'd thrown a tongue depressor at him for that observation, though her aim had been off due to sheer mortification. How the hell did he know she'd been living on dollar ramen and spite for the better part of a month? Now, 3 days later, she stood in the break room at 2 a.m., staring at yet another cup of noodles and wondering if her life choices were somehow detectable by scent. Which was impossible. People couldn't smell what you had for dinner unless you'd bathed in garlic or something equally pungent. Could they? Ma'am. Elena jumped, nearly dropping her sad excuse for a meal. A tall, lean man in an expensive suit stood in the doorway, looking like he'd stepped out of a fashion magazine despite the ungodly hour. Everything about him screamed money, from his perfectly styled dark hair to his shoes that probably cost more than Elena's monthly mortgage payment. Can I help you? She asked, immediately suspicious. Men in $1,000 suits didn't wander into hospital break rooms at 2 a.m. unless they were lost, drunk, or up to something. I'm Caleb Morrison, Mr. Blackthorne's assistant. His smile was polite but didn't reach his eyes, which were currently scanning her like she was a specimen under a microscope. I wondered if I might have a word. Elena's grip tightened on her plastic fork. About Mr. Blackthorne's unusual behavior since your arrival. You mean his creepy propositions and inappropriate comments? Because I can assure you, Mr. Morrison, that's been going on since day one. Caleb's smile flickered. Has it? Interesting. And how long have you worked here, MS? Santos. Elena Santos. And I've been here 15 years, which is 15 years longer than I want to discuss my patient's mental state with his business associates. Something shifted in Caleb's expression at her name, a flash of recognition that was gone almost before she could register it. But she caught it, filed it away in the part of her brain that had kept her alive through 25 years of nursing. 32 years, Caleb murmured almost to himself. Excuse me? He blinked, refocusing on her face. Nothing. Just. Has Mr. Blackthorne mentioned anything about his past? His family, perhaps? Elena set down her ramen with more force than necessary. Mr. Morrison, I don't know what kind of operation you people are running, but I'm a nurse, not a therapist. I check vitals, administer medications, and occasionally duck flying bedpans. I don't provide family counseling for dying billionaires. Of course not. Caleb's voice was smooth as silk and twice as unsettling. It's just that Magnus has been different since you began caring for him. More agitated. More hopeful. He keeps asking about wolves. Wolves. And something about a scent. He says you smell like cheap ramen and poor life choices. Yes, he's mentioned it. Elena crossed her arms, trying to ignore the way Caleb's nostrils flared slightly, like he was testing the air. What was it with these people and smelling things? Look, Mr. Morrison, your boss is dying. Sometimes that makes people act strangely. They fixate on random things, make inappropriate comments, offer ridiculous amounts of money for. She cut herself off, realizing she'd said too much. Caleb leaned forward, suddenly very interested. He's made you offers? Nothing worth discussing. How much? Elena stared at him. I beg your pardon? How much did he offer you? And for what? The casual way he asked made Elena's skin crawl. Like financial propositions from dying men were perfectly normal, everyday occurrences in Caleb Morrison's world. I think this conversation is over, she said, moving toward the door. $500,000, Caleb said quietly. He mentioned $500,000. Elena froze. He told you about that. Magnus tells me everything. The question is, Ms. Santos, why haven't you taken his offer? Most people would jump at that kind of money. Elena turned back to face him, anger flaring in her chest. Most people aren't being propositioned by delusional billionaires who think they can buy whatever they want. And what does Magnus think he can buy? Me, apparently. Caleb's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. And what makes you think he doesn't already own you? The words hit Elena like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making her step backward until her shoulders hit the wall. What did you just say to me? But Caleb was already walking away, his expensive shoes clicking against the linoleum like a countdown timer. Sweet dreams, Miss Santos. Try to avoid the ramen tonight. Magnus prefers you, unmasked. Elena stood alone in the break room for a full 5 minutes, her heart pounding and her hands shaking. What the hell had just happened? And why did Caleb Morrison talk like he knew her, like he'd been waiting for her to show up? 32 years, he'd said. What was 32 years ago? She tried to think back to her childhood, but everything before her 18th birthday was fuzzy, fragmented. She'd always assumed it was normal. Who remembered much from before they were adults? But now, standing in the harsh fluorescent light of a hospital break room, Elena realized how strange it was that she couldn't recall a single clear memory from her life before Elena Santos. Before she'd woken up in a hospital in Seattle with no memory of how she'd gotten there, and a fresh scar on her throat that doctors couldn't explain. 15 years she'd worked at this hospital, and never once had she wondered why she'd chosen nursing, why she'd stayed in the same city where she'd first opened her eyes as an adult. Never once had she questioned why her dreams were filled with running through forests under a full moon, or why she always felt restless when the seasons changed. Now Magnus Blackthorne was looking at her like he knew secrets she'd forgotten, and his assistant was making cryptic comments about ownership and unmasks. Elena abandoned her ramen and headed for the computer terminal in the nurse's station. If these people knew something about her past, she was damn well going to find out what it was. The internet search for Magnus Blackthorne returned thousands of results. Business articles, financial reports, society page photos going back decades. Elena scrolled through them with growing unease, noting how little Magnus had aged over the years. In photos from the 1990s, he looked maybe 40. In photos from the 2000s, he looked the same. Even pictures from 5 years ago showed a man who could have been in his early 50s, not someone pushing 70. She was probably overthinking it. Rich people had access to the best plastic surgeons, the most expensive treatments. Of course he'd aged well. But there was something about his eyes in every photo, something wild and predatory that reminded her of. Elena's breath caught. She'd been about to think wolves, which was ridiculous. Magnus Blackthorne was just a man. A strange, unsettling man with boundary issues and more money than sense, but still just a man. She refined her search, looking for personal information, family connections, anything that might explain his obsession with her. Most of the results were the same business-focused articles, but buried on the 15th page of results, she found something that made her blood run cold. A missing person report from 1992. The headline read, Seattle tech heiress vanishes after hiking accident. But it wasn't the headline that made Elena's hands shake as she clicked on the article. It was the photograph accompanying the story. The missing woman was young, maybe 20 years old, with long dark hair and amber eyes. She had Elena's nose, Elena's smile, Elena's exact facial structure. She looked like Elena's daughter or sister, or she looked like Elena, 30 years ago. The woman's name was listed as Eleanor Ellie Blackthorne. Age 20. Daughter of businessman Magnus Blackthorne and his deceased wife Catherine. Last seen hiking alone in the Olympic Mountains before a severe storm. Despite extensive search efforts, no trace of Eleanor Blackthorne was ever found. Elena read the article 3 times, each pass making less sense than the last. The missing woman looked exactly like her, but Elena Santos had never been hiking in the Olympics. She'd never been Eleanor Blackthorne. She'd never been anyone's daughter except Maria Santos, who died when Elena was a teenager. Hadn't she? Elena's memories of her mother were strangely vague, like looking at photographs through frosted glass. She remembered a woman who smelled like vanilla and sang Spanish lullabies, but when she tried to focus on specific details, they slipped away like smoke. How to tell if dying billionaire is stalker? She typed into the search bar, because at this point, consulting Google seemed like her most rational option. The results were disappointingly unhelpful, mostly relationship advice and articles about celebrity harassment cases. She tried a different approach. Magnus Blackthorne missing daughter Eleanor. This time, she found more than she'd bargained for. Forums, conspiracy theory websites, and amateur detective blogs, all speculating about what had happened to the Blackthorne heiress. Some suggested she'd run away to escape her father's controlling nature. Others theorized about murder, kidnapping, or witness protection. One blog post in particular caught her attention. It was titled The Wolves of Blackthorne Industries, and contained rambling theories about Magnus Blackthorne's business empire, his unusual longevity, and his rumored connections to old families in the Pacific Northwest. Most of it was clearly the work of someone with too much time and not enough medication, but buried in the paranoid ramblings was a single line that made Elena's blood freeze. Eleanor Blackthorne disappeared on the night of her first transformation. Some say Magnus spent 30 years searching for her, never believing she was truly gone. Others say he knew exactly where she was and was waiting for her to come home. Elena slammed the laptop shut, her heart racing. Transformation? First transformation into what? And what did it mean that she'd shown up at this hospital exactly 15 years ago, with no memory of her past and a mysterious scar on her throat? She needed to get back to room 237. She needed to look Magnus Blackthorne in the eye and demand answers. Elena was halfway down the hall when she heard it, a voice drifting from Magnus' room, low and pained and heartbreakingly familiar. "Ellie, please," the voice said, rough with sleep and desperation. "Don't run from me again. I've been waiting so long, baby girl. So damn long." Elena froze outside his door, listening to Magnus talk in his sleep. "I know you're scared. I know you don't remember, but you're safe now. You're home. Daddy's going to take care of everything, I promise. Just don't leave me again." "Daddy." The word hit Elena like a physical blow, sending her stumbling backward against the wall. Images flashed through her mind, fragments of memories she'd thought were dreams. A man with dark hair teaching her to track animals in the woods. Strong arms lifting her high in the air while she squealed with laughter. A deep voice singing her to sleep on stormy nights. "The scent doesn't lie," Magnus continued, his voice growing stronger. "You smell like home, Ellie. You smell like pack and family, and everything I lost when you ran into those woods. My brave, stupid, beautiful daughter." Elena's legs gave out. She slid down the wall until she was sitting on the cold linoleum, her mind reeling with impossible possibilities. Eleanor Blackthorne. Ellie. Had someone really called her Ellie once? Had she really been someone's beloved daughter instead of a woman who'd appeared out of nowhere with a suspicious past and convenient amnesia? "Come back to me," Magnus whispered. "Come back to the pack. Your brothers are waiting, and the moon is almost full. We need you, Ellie. I need you. Brothers. Pack. Full moon." Elena pressed her hands to her temples, trying to stop the spinning. None of this made sense. People didn't just forget 30 years of their lives. They didn't transform into other people. They didn't. A hand touched her shoulder, and Elena looked up to find Caleb Morrison crouching beside her, his expression unreadable. "You heard," he said. It wasn't a question. Elena nodded, not trusting her voice. "How much do you remember?" "Nothing," she whispered. "I don't remember anything before I was 18. I thought that was normal." Caleb's laugh was bitter. "Normal? There's nothing normal about any of this, Eleanor. My name is Elena. Is it? Or is that just what you've been calling yourself for the past 15 years? Elena struggled to her feet, anger replacing the confusion. "I don't know what kind of game you people are playing." "No game," Caleb interrupted. Just a father who's been mourning his daughter for 32 years, and a woman who's been running from herself for half that time. You're insane. Both of you. Am I? Then explain the scar on your throat. Explain why you can smell emotions, why you always know when someone is lying, why you've never been sick a day in your adult life. Elena's hand flew to her throat, to the scar she'd hidden for 15 years. How do you know about? Because I was there the night you got it. I was there when you shifted for the first time and panicked. I was there when you ran into the storm and disappeared for 3 decades. Shifted. The word echoed in Elena's head like a death knell. Shifted into what? She asked, though part of her already knew the answer. Caleb's smile was sharp and wild and completely inhuman. Into exactly what you think, little wolf. Into exactly what you've been running from all these years. From inside room 237 came another sound. Not Magnus' voice this time, but something else. Something that sounded suspiciously like a howl. Chapter 3. Elena Santos stood in the doorway of room 237 at 3:47 a.m., staring at Magnus Blackthorne like he'd just grown a second head. Which, given the night she'd been having, wouldn't have surprised her nearly as much as it should have. "Let me get this straight," she said, her voice carrying the particular brand of deadly calm that every seasoned nurse perfected around year 5. "You're telling me that I'm your daughter who disappeared 30 years ago, but also somehow your destined mate, and I ran away on our bonding night?" Magnus struggled to sit up in his hospital bed, his face flushed with what Elena was beginning to suspect was more than just fever. The dancing puppies on his hospital gown made the whole dramatic declaration somewhat less impressive than he'd probably intended. "Not just any mate, Ellie," he said, his voice dropping to what she assumed was supposed to be a seductive whisper. "My true mate. My omega. The other half of my soul." Elena blinked slowly, processing this information with the same clinical detachment she'd used to assess whether a patient needed a psychiatric consultation. Which, coincidentally, was exactly what she was considering. "Mr. Blackthorne," she said carefully, "when was the last time Dr. Patterson adjusted your pain medication?" Magnus' face cycled through several expressions: hope, confusion, hurt, and finally settling on outrage. "My medication? Are you seriously asking about my medication right now?" "Well, yes. Because what you just told me sounds like the plot of a very disturbing romance novel, and I'm wondering if we need to call someone about possible hallucinations or..." "Hallucinations?" Magnus' voice cracked like a whip. 32 years, Eleanor. 32 years I've searched for you. I've hired private investigators, consulted psychics, followed every rumor and false lead across 3 continents. And when I finally find you, when fate finally brings you back to me, you ask about my medication. Elena pulled out her phone and started making notes in Magnus' chart. Increased agitation, possible delusions of grandeur, romantic fixations on staff members. "I think we definitely need to have Dr. Patterson take a look at your current dosage." "I don't have delusions," Magnus roared, loud enough that Elena was surprised security didn't come running. "You broke my heart. You shattered our pack bonds. You left me standing at the altar of the full moon like a fool while you ran off into the storm." "Uh-huh." Elena looked up from her phone. "And this altar of the full moon, was this at a church or more of an outdoor venue?" Magnus stared at her like she'd just asked if the sky was blue. "It was in the sacred grove, of course, where we've held bonding ceremonies for over 2 centuries, where my parents were mated, and their parents before them. The same grove where you first shifted, where I taught you to hunt, where we..." He stopped abruptly, his expression shifting from anger to something that looked almost like panic. "You really don't remember, do you? Remember what? The cult wedding? The magical grove? The hunting lessons?" Elena shook her head. "Mr. Blackthorne, I think you might be confusing me with someone else. I've never been to any sacred groves, I've never hunted anything more dangerous than a parking space at Walmart, and I definitely haven't been anyone's omega anything." "But the scent," Magnus whispered, his voice suddenly small and lost. "You smell exactly like her. Exactly like my Ellie." Elena felt a strange twinge of something, not quite memory, but an echo of emotion. The desperate way he said that name, the raw pain in his voice, touched something deep in her chest that she'd forgotten existed. For just a moment, she could almost see herself running through dark woods, her heart pounding with panic and something that felt like betrayal. She could almost hear voices calling her name, could almost taste the metallic fear in her mouth as she... "Ma'am!" Elena blinked, the fragment of whatever it was dissolving like smoke. Magnus was staring at her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable, like he was trying to read her soul through her eyes. Did you just remember something? He asked urgently. Even for a second? Did you feel it? I felt like I might need to call security if you don't calm down, Elena lied, because admitting to strange flashes of possible memories seemed like a terrible idea. Look, Mr. Blackthorne. Magnus. He slammed his hand against the bed rail with enough force to make the stand rattle. My name is Magnus, and I am not some random patient you can placate with medical jargon and condescending tones. I am the alpha of the largest pack on the West Coast. I am your mate and your alpha and the man who has loved you since before you knew what love was. Elena took a step backward. She'd dealt with agitated patients before, but Magnus' rage felt different somehow. Wilder. More dangerous. Like standing too close to a caged animal that had just realized the door was unlocked. Okay, she said slowly. Let's say, hypothetically, that everything you're telling me is true. That I'm this Eleanor person, that we were engaged or mated, or whatever you want to call it. Why would I run away? What would make someone leave their family and their fiancé and disappear completely? Magnus went very still. Something flickered across his face, guilt maybe or shame. You were young, he said finally. And scared. The transformation is difficult for some people. Especially Omegas. You needed time to adjust. Adjust to what? To being what you were born to be. Elena crossed her arms. Which is? Mine. The word hung in the air between them like a live grenade. Elena felt that strange echo again, stronger this time. A flash of suffocating panic, of being trapped, of needing to run before something terrible happened. Yours, she repeated flatly. My mate. My Omega. My responsibility to protect and provide for and control. Magnus' mouth snapped shut. Elena nodded slowly. Right. So let me paint a picture here, Magnus. Young woman, 20 years old, suddenly expected to. What exactly? Submit to some kind of arranged marriage? Give up her autonomy to become someone's possession? It wasn't like that, Magnus said quickly, but Elena could hear the lie in his voice. Wasn't it? Because from where I'm standing, it sounds exactly like that. It sounds like a young woman realized she was about to be trapped in a situation where she had no choices and no control over her own life. So she ran. And honestly, good for her. Magnus recoiled like she'd slapped him. Good for her? She destroyed everything. She broke the pack bonds, left me unmated and incomplete, caused 30 years of. Oh, cry me a river. Elena snapped, her temper finally breaking. You know what I hear when you talk? I hear a controlling man who's angry that his property escaped. I hear someone who's spent 30 years obsessing over a woman who clearly wanted nothing to do with him instead of moving on with his life like a normal person. Normal. Magnus laughed, but there was no humor in it. Nothing about us is normal, Elena. We're werewolves. We mate for life. We don't just move on. Elena stared at him. Did you just say werewolves? Don't act like you don't know what you are. I'm a registered nurse with a mortgage and a cat named Whiskers. I am not a werewolf. Magnus' expression shifted from anger to something that looked almost like pity. Look at me, Elena. Really look at me. What do you see? Despite herself, Elena found her gaze drawn to his face. Magnus Blackthorne was undeniably handsome, even dying in a hospital bed. His features were sharp and aristocratic, his dark hair shot through with silver that somehow made him look distinguished rather than old. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, dark brown eyes that seemed to hold depths she couldn't fathom. And for just a moment, she could swear she saw something else looking back at her. Something wild and predatory and definitely not human. Elena shook her head, breaking the spell. I see a sick old man who needs psychiatric evaluation. Magnus let out a sound that was part laugh, part sob. 32 years, he whispered. 32 years of searching, and you don't remember any of it. Not the pack, not the bond, not me. You've been human so long you've forgotten what you really are. Because I am human. Are you? Then explain why you've never been seriously ill. Explain why you can smell emotions, why your reflexes are faster than they should be, why you're stronger than you look. Elena opened her mouth to deny it, then closed it again. Because he was right, wasn't he? She'd never had so much as a cold that lasted more than a day. She could tell when patients were lying just by the change in their scent. And she'd lost count of how many times she'd had to pretend to struggle with heavy equipment, so her co-workers wouldn't ask questions. That doesn't mean I'm a werewolf, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Doesn't it? When was the last time you felt truly at peace, Elena? When was the last time you felt like you belonged somewhere? The questions hit her like physical blows. When had she last felt at peace? When had she ever felt like she truly belonged? Even her closest friendships felt superficial, like she was playing a role rather than being herself. Even her own apartment felt temporary, like she was just passing through. "That's normal," she said weakly. "Lots of people feel displaced. Not like this. Not like you're living someone else's life." Elena's knees went weak. Because he was right again, damn him. She'd spent 15 years feeling like she was wearing a costume that didn't quite fit, playing a part in someone else's story. "I want to speak to your doctor," Magnus said suddenly, his voice taking on the imperious tone of a man accustomed to getting his way. "And the hospital administrator. And whoever's in charge of this ridiculous charade." Elena blinked. "What charade?" "This." Magnus gestured wildly at the room, at her, at the entire situation. "You pretending you don't know me. Someone has clearly tampered with your memories, and I demand to know who and why." "Nobody's tampered with anything. I just don't remember you because I've never met you before this week." "Unacceptable." Magnus was working himself into a full tantrum now, his face red and his voice rising with each word. "I am Magnus Blackthorne. I own half the city. I will not be dismissed by my own mate like some common lunatic." "You're acting like a common lunatic. I want to speak to the manager." Elena stared at him. "The manager? Someone in charge. Someone with authority. Someone who can explain to me why my destined mate is being kept from me through medical incompetence." "Oh my God," Elena breathed, a laugh bubbling up in her throat despite everything. "You're throwing a tantrum. A literal, honest-to-God tantrum because your supposed mate doesn't remember you." Magnus' mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. "I am not throwing a tantrum. I am expressing my legitimate concerns about. You want to speak to the manager about your ungrateful mate. That's what you just said." Magnus fell silent, his face cycling through emotions too quickly for Elena to follow. Finally, he slumped back against his pillows, looking suddenly ancient. 32 years, he whispered again. "I waited 32 years for you to come back to me. I built an empire so I'd be worthy of you. I never took another mate, never bonded with anyone else, because I knew, that someday you'd remember what we had and come home." Despite herself, Elena felt a pang of sympathy. Whatever was wrong with Magnus Blackthorne, his pain was real. His grief was real. Even if his memories were confused, even if he'd somehow convinced himself that a random nurse was his long-lost love, the emotion behind it was genuine. "Magnus," she said softly, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry you lost someone you cared about. But I'm not her. I'm not your Eleanor." Magnus looked up at her with eyes that held 30 years of heartbreak. "Then who are you, Elena Santos? Because if you're not my mate, if you're not Pac, then explain why my wolf recognizes you. Explain why every instinct I have is screaming that you're mine. Explain why, for the first time in 3 decades, I don't want to die." Elena had no answer for that. She had no answer for any of it. All she knew was that standing in this room, looking at this broken, desperate man, she felt something she hadn't experienced in 15 years. She felt like she was exactly where she belonged. And that terrified her more than anything else he'd said. Chapter 4. Elena Santos had seen a lot of strange things in her 15 years as a night shift nurse. She'd seen grown men cry over paper cuts, witnessed family members fight over inheritance while their loved one was still breathing, and once had to physically restrain a woman who tried to smuggle a live chicken into the ICU because she thought it would boost her husband's spirits. But she had never, in all her years of medical experience, seen 30 grown men in Armani suits sobbing in unison around a hospital bed. "This is highly irregular," Dr. Patterson muttered, standing beside Elena in the doorway of room 237. "Hospital policy clearly states that only family members are allowed during visiting hours, and certainly not in groups this size." Elena nodded absently, too fascinated by the spectacle to properly process the doctor's concerns. Magnus Blackthorne lay in his bed looking like death warmed over, his usually sharp features gaunt and his skin bearing the grayish pallor that experienced nurses learned to recognize. His condition had deteriorated rapidly over the past 24 hours, ever since their conversation about werewolves and destined mates and other things that belonged in fantasy novels rather than cardiac care units. But it wasn't Magnus' decline that held Elena's attention. It was the parade of impossibly handsome, impeccably dressed men who had been filing into his room since dawn, each one more dramatic than the last. "Alpha," a tall redhead with shoulders like a linebacker was saying, his voice thick with emotion. "You can't give up. Not now. Not when she's finally here. Please, Magnus." added a younger man with dark hair and eyes the color of winter storms. Fight for your mate. Fight for the pack. We need you. Elena blinked. Did he just say fight for your mate? Dr. Patterson adjusted his glasses nervously. Mr. Morrison assured me these were all business associates. Something about a board meeting regarding Mr. Blackthorne's medical decisions. That's the weirdest board meeting I've ever seen, Elena muttered, watching as another suit-clad man, this one blonde and built like a Norse god, dropped to his knees beside Magnus' bed. 27 years I've served this pack, the blonde was saying, tears streaming down his perfectly sculpted cheekbones. 27 years I've watched you suffer, watched you search for her, watched you refuse every potential mate because your heart belonged to someone who was already gone. Don't you dare leave us now that she's back. She's not back, Magnus whispered, his voice so weak Elena had to strain to hear it. She's gone. My Ellie is gone, and what's left is just someone who wears her face. Elena felt that strange twist in her chest again, the same one she'd experienced when Magnus had first called her by that name. Ellie. Why did it sound so familiar? Why did it make her want to both run towards something and away from it at the same time? This is getting ridiculous, she announced, pushing past Dr. Patterson into the room. I don't know what kind of corporate culture you people have, but crying over your boss's deathbed is not normal business behavior. The conversation stopped instantly. 30 pairs of eyes, an unsettling variety of colors ranging from amber to green to that same winter storm gray, turned to stare at her. Elena felt like a gazelle who'd just wandered into a pride of lions. Ma'am. Caleb Morrison appeared at her elbow, somehow managing to look polished and professional despite the chaos around them. Perhaps you could give us a moment. Absolutely not. Elena crossed her arms, falling back on the authority that came with scrubs and a stethoscope. This man is critically ill, and you're all making it worse with your, whatever this is. Group therapy? Corporate bonding ritual? Really elaborate flash mob. The redhead with the linebacker's shoulders let out a sound that was suspiciously close to a growl. Show some respect. Do you have any idea who you're talking to? A bunch of overdramatic businessmen having what appears to be a collective nervous breakdown? Elena shot back. Yeah, I've got a pretty good idea. The tension in the room ratcheted up several notches. Elena could practically feel the hostility radiating from Magnus' so-called associates, but she'd faced down angry family members before. The key was projecting confidence, even when you were vastly outnumbered by people who looked like they bench-pressed cars for fun. Enough, Magnus said weakly, and the effect was immediate. Every man in the room turned toward him with an attention that bordered on reverence. Leave her alone. This isn't her fault. Alpha, the blonde started. I said enough. Magnus' voice carried a weight that Elena couldn't quite identify, something that made even her instincts sit up and take notice. Elena, could you check my 4? I think something's wrong with the flow. Elena approached the bed cautiously, hyper-aware of being watched by 30 pairs of predatory eyes. Magnus' 4 was flowing perfectly fine, but she made a show of adjusting the tubing anyway. Your friends are very dedicated, she said quietly. Magnus' laugh turned into a coughing fit that left flecks of blood on his lips. Elena's training kicked in immediately. She was reaching for the oxygen mask when Magnus caught her wrist. They're not just friends, he whispered. They're family. And they're terrified of losing the only father some of them have ever known. Elena paused, caught by something in his voice. Father? Pack leader. Alpha. Same thing, really. Magnus' eyes drifted closed. I've spent 30 years taking in strays, building something that could survive without me. But now that the time has come. You're not dying today, Elena said firmly, checking his pulse. It was rapid and irregular, stress and heartbreak wreaking havoc on his already damaged cardiovascular system. But you need to calm down. This emotional drama isn't helping your condition. Neither is having my mate treat me like a stranger, Magnus murmured. Elena sighed. They were back to this again. Magnus. I know you don't remember, he interrupted. I know you think I'm delusional. But could you just pretend? For them? They've been waiting so long to meet their Luna. They're what now? Their pack mother. The alpha female. My mate. Elena stared down at him, taking in the genuine desperation in his eyes. Behind her, she could hear muffled sobs and whispered conversations in what sounded like multiple languages. These men, whoever they were, genuinely believed Magnus was their leader, their father figure. And they genuinely believed she was important to him. Okay, she said finally. I'll stay. But only because you need to keep your stress levels down, and apparently my presence helps with that. Magnus' smile was radiant. Thank you. Elena turned back to face the room full of grown men in various states of emotional distress. Right. Since I'm apparently stuck here, let's establish some ground rules. First, no more than 5 people crying at once. It's disturbing and loud. Second, if you're going to have emotional breakdowns, please do it quietly. This is a hospital, not a soap opera. The blonde man, who had finally gotten up off his knees, raised his hand tentatively. Ma'am? Could we talk to you? About the Alpha? About Magnus? What about him? About how much he loves you, the redhead said, his voice breaking on the last word. About how he spent 3 decades searching for you, turning down every potential mate, building this pack into something worthy of. Okay, stop. Elena held up a hand. I get it. You all think Magnus and I have some epic love story. But I've already explained to him that I'm not whoever he thinks I am. But you are, the winter storm-eyed man insisted. You have to be. You smell like cheap ramen and desperation. Yes, I've heard this before. Elena rubbed her temples, feeling a headache building. Look, I don't know what kind of organization you guys are running here. But we're a pack, the blonde said simply. A family. And you're our Luna. Elena looked around the room, taking in the earnest faces, the expensive suits, the way they all deferred to Magnus despite his weakened condition. A pack. Like a wolf pack. Exactly like that, Caleb confirmed. Right. Elena nodded slowly. So either you're all members of some kind of new age spiritual group that takes animal symbolism very seriously, or you're telling me you're actual werewolves. The silence that followed was deafening. The werewolves thing, the redhead said eventually. Definitely the werewolves thing. Elena stared at him. Then she started laughing. It started as a giggle, then built into full-blown hysterical laughter that had her doubled over and gasping for breath. Oh my God, she wheezed. You're serious. You're actually serious. 30 grown men in 3-piece suits just told me they're werewolves, and they're completely serious about it. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Elena wiped tears from her eyes, still chuckling, and looked around at a sea of offended faces. You don't believe us, the blonde said flatly. I believe you believe it, Elena said diplomatically. I've seen stranger coping mechanisms. Grief does weird things to people. And if thinking you're werewolves helps you process whatever's happening with Magnus, then more power to you. Show her, the redhead growled. No, Magnus said sharply, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. She's not ready. She's never going to be ready if we don't. I said no. The force of Magnus' command had every man in the room taking a step back. She chose to forget us, to forget what she was. I won't force her to remember. Elena felt that strange twist again, stronger this time. For just a moment, she could almost see herself running through dark woods, could almost feel branches catching at her clothes as she fled from. From what? From whom? Magnus, she said softly, moving closer to his bedside. What if I didn't choose to forget? What if something happened to me? Something that made me lose my memories? Hope flared in Magnus' eyes, so bright it was painful to look at. You think? I think, Elena interrupted carefully, that I've been having some very strange experiences lately. Dreams that don't feel like dreams. Instincts I can't explain. And reactions to you that don't make sense if we're complete strangers. The room held its collective breath. But, Elena continued, I also think that even if we did know each other, even if we had some kind of relationship, you can't expect me to just pick up where we supposedly left off. People change, Magnus. Even if I am your Eleanor, I'm not the same person I was 30 years ago. Magnus' face crumpled. I know that. I hoped that somewhere inside, some part of her still existed. Some part that still loved me. The pain in his voice was unbearable. Elena found herself reaching out without thinking, taking his hand in hers. The moment their skin made contact, she felt something shift inside her. A recognition so deep it bypassed her conscious mind entirely. Home, something inside her whispered. Safe. Pack. Alpha. Elena jerked her hand back, her heart racing. What was that? Bond recognition, Caleb said quietly. Your wolf knows her mate, even if your human mind has forgotten. I don't have a wolf, Elena said automatically, but even as the words left her mouth, she wasn't sure they were true. Something was stirring inside her, something wild and restless that had been sleeping for far too long. Everyone out, Magnus said suddenly, his voice weak but commanding. All of you. Leave us alone. Alpha, we can't. Out. Magnus' eyes flashed with something that definitely wasn't human. Now! The pack filed out reluctantly, each man stopping to bow slightly to Magnus before leaving. Elena noticed that several of them also nodded respectfully to her, which was both confusing and oddly touching. When they were finally alone, Magnus turned to face her fully. "Elena," he said, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. What I'm about to tell you is going to sound impossible, but I need you to try to keep an open mind." Elena pulled up a chair, settling in for what was clearly going to be a long conversation. "I'm listening. 32 years ago, you were Eleanor Blackthorne. You were my daughter, my heir, and on your 20th birthday, you were also supposed to become my mate." Elena's stomach lurched. "Your daughter and your mate? That's not blood relation," Magnus said quickly. "I adopted you when you were 5, after your biological parents were killed. In pack law, that makes you family but not blood family. The mating would have been perfectly legal and appropriate." "Appropriate for whom?" Elena's voice was sharp. "Because it sounds to me like you raised a child specifically to become your wife, which is about as far from appropriate as you can get." Magnus flinched. "It wasn't like that. The bond between us was natural, fated. I fought it for years, tried to arrange other matches for you. But the wolf doesn't lie. You were meant to be mine." Elena stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. "So let me get this straight. You adopted a 5-year-old, raised her as your daughter, and then expected her to marry you when she turned 20 because of some mystical wolf bond." "Yes." "And when she ran away instead, you spent 30 years tracking her down?" "Yes." Elena turned back to face him. "Magnus, do you have any idea how that sounds? Do you understand why a 20-year-old woman might have run from that situation?" Magnus was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "I understand that I failed her. That I pushed too hard, expected too much. That I let my own needs override her comfort and choice." He looked up at Elena with eyes full of regret. "I understand that she ran because I gave her no other option." The simple admission hit Elena like a physical blow. She'd expected denials, excuses, justifications. She hadn't expected this broken acknowledgement of fault. "But I also understand," Magnus continued, "that she was my mate, that we belong together. That 30 years apart hasn't changed that fundamental truth." Elena sank back into her chair, overwhelmed by the weight of everything she was learning. Somewhere inside her, buried under 15 years of life as Elena Santos, Eleanor Blackthorne was stirring. And she was absolutely terrified of what might happen if she fully woke up. Chapter 5. Elena Santos stared at the pile of bills scattered across her kitchen table like fallen leaves after a particularly brutal storm. Credit card statements, student loan notices, her daughter's college fund sitting at a pathetic $342.18. All of it adding up to a number that made her stomach churn and her head spin. $67,432. That's what freedom cost, apparently. That's what it would take to dig herself out of the financial hole that 15 years of single motherhood and medical school debt had carved into her life. She picked up Magnus Blackthorne's business card, cream-colored, expensive, with raised lettering that probably cost more than her weekly grocery budget. Caleb Morrison had pressed it into her hand before leaving the hospital the night before, along with a message that kept echoing in her head. "He's offering you everything, Elena. The only question is whether you're brave enough to take it." Everything. Magnus was offering her everything. The money to pay off her debts, clear her daughter's path to college, maybe even buy a decent car that didn't require a prayer every time she turned the key. All she had to do was pretend to be the love of his life for whatever time he had left. It was mercenary. It was potentially unethical. It was definitely the most complicated lie she'd ever considered telling. It was also the answer to every prayer she'd whispered into her pillow during the darkest 3 a.m. moments of the past year. Elena picked up her phone and dialed before she could lose her nerve. "Magnus?" she said when he answered on the first ring, his voice rough with sleep and medication. "It's Elena. We need to talk." 2 hours later, Elena sat in Magnus' hospital room with a contract spread between them that looked more like a business merger than a fake relationship agreement. Caleb Morrison hovered nearby with a pen that probably cost more than Elena's monthly rent, looking annoyingly pleased with himself. "So let me make sure I understand this," Elena said, scanning the legal document. "I agree to pose as your, what did you call it? Rediscovered mate? For the duration of your stay here, and possibly through any hospice care that might be necessary." Magnus nodded, though something flickered in his eyes at the word, hospice. In return, all your debts are cleared immediately, and you receive a monthly stipend of $10,000 for as long as the arrangement continues. Elena's hand tightened on the contract. $10,000 a month. She could quit her second job, spend actual time with her daughter instead of passing her in the hallway between shifts, maybe even take a vacation that didn't involve camping in her sister's backyard. And what exactly does this fake relationship entail? She asked carefully. Because I need to be very clear about boundaries here. Magnus' smile was sad but genuine. Nothing you're not comfortable with. Hold my hand occasionally. Let me tell you stories about our supposed past. Pretend you remember me fondly. Maybe let me pretend I still have something to live for. The vulnerability in his voice nearly undid her resolve. This wasn't about manipulation or control. This was about a dying man who wanted to spend his last days believing he wasn't completely alone in the world. Okay, Elena said, reaching for the pen. But we do this my way. I'm not going to suddenly become some submissive little mate who hangs on your every word. If you want me to play a role, it's going to be the role of a woman who chose to come back, not one who was dragged back against her will. Magnus' eyes brightened with something that looked suspiciously like hope. Deal. Elena signed her name with a flourish, trying to ignore the voice in her head that whispered she was making either the best decision of her life or the worst mistake. The first lesson in being Magnus Blackthorn's fake mate took place that very afternoon, with Caleb serving as some sort of supernatural relationship coach and Elena trying desperately not to laugh at the absurdity of it all. Tell me about our first kiss, Magnus said, settling back against his pillows with the expectant look of a man about to share a treasured memory. Elena blinked. Our first kiss? I thought we were starting with basic background information. The pack will want to know, Caleb explained. Luna's first kiss with her alpha is considered sacred. They'll ask for details. Okay, Elena said slowly. So what happened during this sacred first kiss? Magnus' eyes went soft and distant. It was during the full moon celebration of your 18th birthday. You'd just completed your second transformation. Wait, hold on. Elena held up a hand. My second transformation? Into what, exactly? Into your wolf form, obviously, Magnus said, looking at her like she'd asked why water was wet. Your first transformation was traumatic, as they often are for young Omegas. But by your second, you were starting to embrace your true nature. Elena nodded politely while making mental notes. Either Magnus had constructed an incredibly elaborate fantasy life, or she was learning about werewolf biology from someone who genuinely believed he'd lived it. So after this transformation, she prompted, you ran through the forest for hours, reveling in your wolf form. When you finally shifted back to human form at dawn, you were naked, covered in mud, and absolutely glowing with joy. Elena felt heat creep up her neck. Naked? Shifting destroys clothing, Caleb explained matter-of-factly. It's perfectly natural. Right. Natural. Elena cleared her throat. So I was naked and muddy, and then? Magnus' smile turned tender. You looked at me standing there with a blanket to cover you, and you said, I finally understand what I am. Then you kissed me. Soft at first, then deeper, until I thought I might lose my mind from wanting you. Elena stared at him. That's actually kind of beautiful. It was the most perfect moment of my life, Magnus said quietly. Right up until you pulled away and told me you weren't ready for what came next. There was something in his voice that made Elena's chest tighten. A wistfulness that spoke of genuine loss, genuine regret. For a moment, she could almost see it. A young woman kissing an older man in the dawn light, both of them desperate for connection but terrified of what it might cost. What came next? She asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. The bonding ceremony, Magnus said. The ritual that would have made us true mates connected for life. Elena shifted uncomfortably. Connected how exactly? Soul deep, Caleb supplied helpfully. Telepathic bond, shared emotions, the ability to sense each other's location and well-being. Complete spiritual and physical unity. Elena's mouth went dry. That sounds intense. It is, Magnus agreed. Which is why you got scared and ran. Which is why I should have been more patient, given you more time to understand what it meant. The regret in his voice was so thick Elena could practically taste it. Without thinking, she reached out and covered his hand with hers. Maybe she wasn't ready, Elena said softly. Maybe she needed to figure out who she was before she could figure out who she was with someone else. Magnus' fingers intertwined with hers, and Elena felt that strange spark again. The one that made her think of home and safety and belonging. Maybe, Magnus said, his thumb stroking across her knuckles. But I missed her every day she was gone. Missed her laugh, her stubbornness, the way she challenged me when she thought I was being an idiot. Elena found herself smiling. She challenged you? Constantly. She was never impressed by the alpha thing. Used to tell me that being pack leader didn't mean I was always right, just that I was responsible for cleaning up the messes when I was wrong. Smart woman, Elena said, and was surprised to realize she meant it. Magnus' gaze intensified. The smartest. Beautiful, fierce, compassionate, stubborn as hell. She would have made an incredible Luna. Elena felt something flutter in her chest. Part warmth, part panic. Magnus. I know, he said quickly. I know you're not her. I know this is pretend. But sitting here with you, talking about her, it feels like maybe she's not completely gone. Elena squeezed his hand, confused by the mix of emotions swirling through her. Tell me more about her. About us. What other memories should I know? Magnus' face lit up like she'd just given him the most precious gift in the world. Where do I start? There was the time you got into a fight with 3 male wolves for picking on a younger pack member. For the next 3 hours, Magnus regaled her with stories that sounded like they belonged in a supernatural romance novel. Elena learned about Eleanor's fierce protectiveness over younger pack members, her talent for healing both physical and emotional wounds, and her apparently impressive ability to put arrogant alpha males in their place. She also learned about werewolf courtship rituals that made her face burn with embarrassment. So when you wanted to show affection, Elena said carefully, you would bite my neck? Claiming bites, Magnus corrected. Gentle ones, usually on the throat or shoulder. It marks you as mine and provides comfort through the transfer of scent. Elena nodded slowly. Right, so basically hickeys with teeth. Magnus looked confused. I'm not familiar with that term. Never mind, Elena said quickly, making another mental note. What about the hunting dates you mentioned? Some of our most romantic evenings, Magnus said with a nostalgic smile. We'd shift into wolf form and hunt together through the forest, then share our kill under the stars. Elena tried to picture herself gnawing on a raw deer carcass by moonlight and barely suppressed a shudder. That sounds primal. Incredibly intimate, Magnus agreed. There's nothing more bonding than taking down prey together, sharing the feast, curling up together afterward with full bellies and… Okay, Elena interrupted, her face flaming. I think I get the picture. Caleb, who had been silent through most of the story-sharing session, finally spoke up. You should know that the pack is planning a small celebration for tomorrow night. Nothing elaborate, just a chance for everyone to formally meet their Luna. Elena's stomach dropped. A celebration? With all 30 of those guys from yesterday. Plus their mates and children, Magnus said. The whole family wants to meet you. How many people are we talking about? Elena asked weakly. Maybe 80. 90. Caleb said with a shrug. It's hard to get an exact count with the little ones. Elena stared at them. You want me to convince 90 werewolves that I'm their long-lost pack mother? People who knew the real Eleanor. You are the real Eleanor, Magnus said firmly. You just need to remember who you used to be. Elena wanted to argue, but something in his voice stopped her. There was such certainty there, such absolute conviction, that for a moment she almost believed him herself. What if they can tell I'm lying? She asked instead. You won't be lying, Magnus said. You'll just be rediscovering truths you've forgotten. Elena wasn't sure there was a difference, but she nodded anyway. Fine. 1 pack meeting. But I'm going to need a lot more coaching before tomorrow night. Magnus' smile was radiant. We'll practice all night if necessary. That night, Elena dreamed of running. She was in wolf form, her paws silent against the forest floor, every sense heightened to an almost painful degree. She could smell Magnus nearby, warm and wild and utterly male, and the knowledge that he was hunting alongside her filled her with a fierce joy. They brought down a deer together, their teamwork flawless, and afterward they lay curled together in a clearing, her smaller wolf form tucked against his larger one. She felt safe, protected, cherished in a way that went beyond human understanding. When she woke, Elena could still taste the metallic tang of fresh blood in her mouth, could still feel phantom fur covering her skin. The dream had been so vivid, so real, that for a moment she'd forgotten she was Elena Santos, practical nurse and single mother. For a moment, she'd been someone else entirely. Elena shook her head, pushing away the unsettling feelings the dream had stirred up. It was just her imagination, obviously. All of Magnus' stories were getting tangled up in her subconscious, creating elaborate fantasies that felt more real than they should. That had to be what it was. Because the alternative, that she was actually starting to remember a life she'd never lived, was too terrifying to consider. Elena got up and made herself a cup of coffee, trying to ignore the way her hands shook as she reached for the mug. Just nerves, she told herself. Just the stress of the elaborate lie she was about to tell. But as she sat in her kitchen, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and pink, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere deep inside her, something was beginning to wake up. Something that had been sleeping for far too long. Chapter 6. Elena Santos was in the middle of explaining to Magnus why werewolf healing abilities didn't exempt him from taking his prescribed medications when the door to room 237 burst open with enough force to rattle the windows. The woman who stormed in looked like she'd stepped off the cover of a high-end fashion magazine. Tall, elegant, with silver-streaked black hair pulled into a perfect chignon and cheekbones that could cut glass. She wore a cream-colored suit that probably cost more than Elena's annual salary, and her amber eyes blazed with the kind of righteous fury that Elena recognized from years of dealing with angry family members. Except this particular angry family member was clearly related to Magnus. The resemblance was unmistakable. The same aristocratic features, the same predatory grace, the same aura of barely contained power that made Elena's nursing instincts sit up and take notice. "So," the woman said, her voice cultured and cold, "you're the famous Elena Santos." Elena blinked, automatically moving to place herself between the newcomer and Magnus' bed. "I'm sorry, and you are?" "Lydia Blackthorne," the woman replied, her gaze raking over Elena with obvious disdain. "Magnus' sister. And the woman who spent the last 32 years cleaning up the mess you left behind." Elena felt Magnus tense behind her. "Lydia," he said, his voice carrying a warning. "Elena doesn't remember." "Oh, how convenient," Lydia snapped, advancing into the room like a general surveying a battlefield. 32 years of therapy bills, private investigators, and my brother slowly dying of heartbreak, and now the woman responsible for it all claims she doesn't remember. How typically selfish of you, Eleanor. Elena's temper, already strained from a double shift and too little sleep, finally snapped. "Look, lady, I don't know what your damage is, but I'm a registered nurse doing my job. If you want to have a family therapy session, you can schedule it during normal visiting hours like everyone else." Lydia stopped dead, clearly not expecting pushback. Did you just tell me to schedule an appointment? I told you to show some respect for hospital protocol and your brother's health." Elena shot back. "He's recovering from a cardiac episode, not hosting a family reunion." For a moment, the two women stared at each other across the hospital room like gunfighters at high noon. Elena could practically feel the tension crackling in the air between them. Then, to Elena's complete surprise, Lydia threw back her head and laughed. "Oh my God," she gasped, wiping tears from her eyes. "You really don't remember anything, do you? The Eleanor I knew would have shifted by now, and tried to bite my throat out for talking to her like that." Elena crossed her arms. "The Elena you're talking to now is going to call security if you don't calm down and explain what you're doing here." Lydia's laughter faded, replaced by something that looked almost like curiosity. "You really are different. 32 years ago, you would have already established dominance. Now you're hiding behind human authority structures." "I'm not hiding behind anything," Elena said irritably. "I'm trying to do my job, which involves keeping my patients' stress levels down. Something that's pretty difficult when their relatives are barging in here throwing accusations around." "Relatives?" Lydia repeated thoughtfully. "Interesting choice of words." Magnus cleared his throat weakly. "Lydia, please. Elena has agreed to stay with me for whatever time I have left. Don't ruin this." Lydia's expression softened as she looked at her brother, and Elena caught a glimpse of genuine love beneath all the anger and frustration. "Magnus, you can't keep doing this to yourself. Living in the past, building fantasies around someone who..." "Someone who what?" Elena interrupted, because despite herself, she was curious about what Lydia thought she knew. Lydia turned back to her, amber eyes sharp with assessment. "Someone who ran away because she was too selfish and immature to handle the responsibilities that came with being Pac Luna." Elena felt that familiar twist in her chest, the one that always accompanied discussions of her supposed past. "And you know this how?" "Because I was there the night you left," Lydia said bluntly. "I was there when you told Magnus you couldn't handle Pac life, couldn't handle the pressure of being his mate, couldn't handle the expectations everyone had for you. I was there when you packed your bags and walked away from everything without a backward glance." Magnus made a sound of protest, but Lydia continued relentlessly. I was also there for the 32 years afterward, watching my brother refuse every potential mate, turn down every chance at happiness, because he was convinced you'd been kidnapped or coerced, or somehow forced to leave against your will. Elena's stomach dropped. He thought I was kidnapped? He thought anything except the truth, Lydia said with bitter amusement. That you chose to leave. That you wrote him a letter explaining exactly why you couldn't stay. That you specifically asked him not to follow you because you needed space to figure out who you were without the pack, without him, without all the supernatural politics you'd been thrust into. The room fell silent except for the steady beep of Magnus' monitors. Elena could feel both siblings watching her, waiting for her reaction, but her mind felt strangely blank. She'd run away. She'd written a letter. She'd asked not to be followed. She'd chosen to leave. I don't remember any of that, she said finally. Of course you don't, Lydia said, but her tone had lost some of its bite. Because remembering would mean taking responsibility for the choice you made. It's easier to play the victim, isn't it? Let everyone believe you were taken against your will rather than admit you abandoned someone who loved you more than life itself. Elena felt something crack inside her chest, not quite memory, but an echo of guilt so profound it nearly brought her to her knees. Images flashed through her mind. A young woman packing a bag with tears streaming down her face, writing a letter with shaking hands, looking back one last time at a house full of people who'd called her family before disappearing into the night. Stop, Magnus said weakly from his bed. Lydia, that's enough. But Lydia wasn't finished. Do you want to know what the letter said, Elena? Because I memorized every word. Magnus carried it with him for 5 years before it finally fell apart from being read so many times. Elena's hands were shaking. I can't be what you need me to be, Lydia recited, her voice taking on a formal, almost ritualistic cadence. I can't be the Luna you deserve, the mate you've waited for, the daughter you raised me to become. I feel like I'm drowning in expectations, suffocating under the weight of a destiny I never chose. I need space to figure out who Eleanor Blackthorne really is when she's not trying to live up to everyone else's dreams. Please don't follow me. Please don't look for me. Let me go, Magnus. Let me find my own way home. The words hit Elena like physical blows. She could almost hear her own voice saying them, could almost feel the desperate panic that must have driven her to write such a letter. I signed it forever yours, Ellie, Lydia continued relentlessly, which was particularly cruel, considering you were walking away forever. That's enough. Magnus' voice cracked like a whip, carrying enough authority to make both women take a step back. She was 20 years old, Lydia. 20 years old and terrified and overwhelmed by everything we'd put on her shoulders. Yes, she left. Yes, it destroyed me. But she was entitled to make that choice. Lydia's expression crumpled slightly. She broke you, Magnus. For 32 years, I've watched you slowly die inside because of a choice she made. And now she's back, conveniently claiming amnesia, ready to play the victim all over again. I'm not playing anything, Elena said quietly. I genuinely don't remember any of this. But if what you're saying is true, if I really did write that letter and leave voluntarily, she swallowed hard. Then I'm sorry. I'm sorry for whatever pain I caused, even if I don't remember causing it. Lydia stared at her for a long moment, clearly trying to reconcile Elena's apparent sincerity with her preconceived notions. You really don't remember writing it? I don't remember anything before I was 18, Elena admitted. I woke up in a hospital in Seattle with no memory of my past, and a scar on my throat that doctors couldn't explain. I've been Elena Santos ever since. A scar on your throat, Lydia repeated slowly. From your first transformation? Elena's hand went automatically to the mark she'd been hiding with makeup for 15 years. Magnus mentioned something about that. About it being traumatic. Lydia sank into the visitor's chair, some of the fight going out of her. It was more than traumatic. You nearly died. The shift went wrong somehow. Instead of a clean transformation, you got stuck halfway between forms. Magnus found you convulsing in the woods, your throat torn open where you'd tried to claw away the pain. Elena felt sick. What happened? He carried you home, called in every healer we could find. You were unconscious for 3 days. When you finally woke up, you were different, quieter, more fragile. The pack physician said the trauma might have affected your memory, but we hoped it would come back with time. But it didn't, Elena said. No. If anything, you seemed to get more and more disconnected from pack life. You stopped participating in runs, avoided the other pack members, spent most of your time alone. Lydia's voice was softer now, almost sad. Magnus tried to give you space, tried to be patient, but the bonding ceremony was approaching and the pack was expecting their Luna to step up, Elena finished. Exactly. And instead, you ran away in the middle of the night, leaving nothing but a letter and a broken alpha behind. Elena closed her eyes, trying to process everything she'd learned. She'd had a family. She'd had a place in the world, people who'd cared about her, a man who'd loved her enough to search for 32 years. And she'd thrown it all away because she was scared. So what happens now? She asked, opening her eyes to find both Blackthorns watching her intently. Now, Lydia said, you have to decide what you want more, the comfortable lie you've been living as Elena Santos, or the complicated truth of who you really are. Elena looked at Magnus, taking in his hopeful expression, the way his hands clenched the bedsheets like he was afraid she might disappear again. Then she looked at Lydia, who was clearly struggling between decades of resentment and a growing understanding of Elena's situation. What if I can't be Eleanor Blackthorn anymore? Elena asked quietly. What if too much has changed? What if I'm not the person you remember? Then we'll figure out who you are now, Magnus said simply. But Elena, you have to understand, running away didn't make you human. It just made you a werewolf who forgot how to howl. Elena felt tears prick at her eyes. I don't know how to be what you need. You don't have to be anything but yourself, Magnus assured her. The woman sitting here right now, arguing with hospital administrators and throwing bedpans at difficult patients, that's still Eleanor. That's still the fierce, stubborn, compassionate woman I fell in love with. Lydia snorted softly. He's right, you know. You threw a bedpan at him? Eleanor would have done exactly the same thing. Despite everything, Elena found herself smiling. You think so? I know so. Eleanor never let anyone, including Magnus, get away with being ridiculous. She had zero tolerance for dramatic alpha posturing. Lydia paused, then added with grudging respect. She also had terrible taste in midnight snacks. I'm assuming you still live on ramen noodles. Elena's smile widened. Chicken flavor. The cheap stuff. Some things never change, Lydia said with something that might have been affection. Though I have to ask, do werewolves get good health insurance these days? Because Magnus' medical bills are going to be astronomical, and pack finances aren't what they used to be. Elena burst out laughing at the practical question. Are you seriously asking me about werewolf health insurance? Someone has to be practical around here, Lydia said defensively. Magnus is too busy being dramatic about his tragic lost love, and the rest of the pack just throws money at problems instead of actually solving them. I like her, Elena said to Magnus, who was watching their interaction with obvious delight. I was hoping you would, he replied. She's been wanting to yell at you for 32 years. Lydia huffed. I've had a very nice speech prepared about responsibility and loyalty and the proper way to treat family. It's a shame it's completely useless now that you've turned out to be genuinely apologetic about the whole thing. Elena felt something settle in her chest, not quite memory, but a sense of rightness she hadn't experienced in years. These people, this complicated family dynamic, felt familiar in a way that went deeper than conscious thought. So, she said carefully, hypothetically speaking, if I wanted to try to remember who I used to be, how would I go about doing that? Magnus' face lit up like she'd just offered him the moon. There are ways. Pack rituals, scent memory exercises, spending time in the places that were important to Eleanor. And if I remember everything and decide I still can't handle pack life? Then you leave again, Lydia said bluntly. But this time you do it honestly. No disappearing acts, no mysterious letters. You tell us face to face that you choose your human life over your supernatural one. Elena nodded slowly. And you'd accept that? We'd have to, Magnus said quietly. I won't make the same mistake twice, Elena. I won't try to force you into a role you don't want. If you choose to stay human, choose to stay Elena Santos, I'll respect that choice. Elena looked between the two siblings, Magnus with his desperate hope, Lydia with her grudging acceptance, and realized she was standing at a crossroads. She could walk away right now, go back to her simple life of night shifts and ramen noodles and financial stress. Or she could step into the unknown, into a world where she might be someone entirely different from the woman she'd thought she was. Okay, she said finally. Let's see if we can find Eleanor Blackthorn. But I'm doing this as Elena Santos, keeping my job, my apartment, my life. If Eleanor decides to stick around, we'll figure out how she fits into Elena's world. Magnus reached for her hand, and when their fingers intertwined, Elena felt that spark again, stronger this time, more insistent. Home, something whispered in the back of her mind. Pack. Family. Maybe it was time to stop running and find out what she'd been running from. Thank you for listening to this story. Like, share, and subscribe for more.